Today we will be replacing this with this. What's up everybody? Today we will be pulling out the stock radiator and swapping in a nice brand new one. It is pretty easy to pull out the old radiator. We just have to drain it out, pull the fans out, and then swap in the brand new one. I've already got the car lifted up. It's on jack stands. I also have the back end of the car up just a little bit more than the front, just so the engine is leaning forward so all of the coolant can come out of the block, or as much as we can get out of the block. Per the rules this year, we do have to take the antifreeze out of the car and run water. I will only have to pull out a couple of things out of the way. I do need to take the air cleaner off so we can slip the fans out this direction. Once the radiator is all drained, then we will take off the upper radiator hose and the lower and make sure that's all disconnected, and then the fans come out via 4 bolts per fan, and then we can just pull those right out along with the shroud that is bolted to the back side of the radiator. The stock radiator is about 1 inch thick, so it's very thin. It's very easy to come in and out. We are going to keep this radiator as a backup or as a spare. This was brand new about 2 years ago. When I bought the car, I slapped in a nice new fresh OEM radiator, so it is still in very good condition. We'll just put it up on the shelf and save it for a rainy day if we ever need it. Last year I did have to do some engine work. I had to drain the radiator, and when I went to put the drain plug back into the radiator, it actually snapped in half and the threads were completely shot. I ended up JB welding that drain plug back in just to be able to make it through the last event of the season. So we won't be able to drain the radiator via the drain plug. I will just have to pop off the lower radiator hose and have it just gush all over the place. I do have a fairly large pan, so hopefully we will be able to catch the majority of the antifreeze. It is fresh antifreeze. I do not want to just get rid of it. I want to save it. So come winter, we can put this back into the car and get rid of the water. Might be a little tricky to see down there, but that lower radiator hose underneath the intercooler pipe is what we need to take off first. This is technically my oil drain pan for doing oil changes, but I scrubbed it out so it's nice and clean, so it doesn't contaminate the antifreeze because I don't have another pan to use. This should be just fine. Then from here, I will transfer it into a different jug to save it for winter. To get this radiator hose off, it's just a pinch clamp or a squeeze clamp. These OEM clamps are very, very well made or well designed. They hold much better than like the screwdriver style that you have to twist and turn on. Let's see how difficult this is to get off of here. It hasn't been off for a long time. I might need to grab something to stick in here to spread it out. It's kind of moving. So we're going to let the radiator drain for a little bit. We're going to move to the top side, start taking the fans out and the upper radiator hose. I also need to take out the overflow reservoir and drain that out because there is antifreeze in that as well. Then we will top that off with some fresh distilled water. I do need to pull off this portion of the intercooler piping, otherwise this is not going to come out of here. So we'll get that off too. Now that we have the fans out and the intercooler pipe out of the way, now we just have to remove 2 12mm bolts and the radiator should be able to lift right out of the car. Just let the rest of this kind of drain out here. It's just a little bit left sitting in there. Just looking at it from the front, it is pretty dusty and dirty. It doesn't get cleaned or see any water because the intercooler is right in front of this. Now that the old radiator is out of the vehicle, I just need to swap over this pin and that pin over to the bottom side of the new radiator Those basically just rest down into a little groove at the bottom of where the radiator mounts. So before I forgot, I went ahead and took the new drain plug out. There is a rubber O-ring on here. I just dabbed a little bit of oil on that so that it doesn't tear when we tighten that down. This does not have to be wrenched down super tight. Just seal it enough and then go a little past snug just to make sure it's sealed. You don't want to crush the O-ring completely, otherwise you'll have leaking issues out the bottom of your radiator. And it's only aluminum, so those threads can pull out very easily, very fast. It does bottom out before you go too tight. We'll throw a little wrench on there and just snug it up a little bit. I almost forgot about these little rubber bushings that are on the top side of the radiator as well. Those are to like absorb any shock or vibration. You don't want aluminum or anything to be cracking on your radiator. That causes problems. The next step, we need to take these pins out. These are the second shock absorber pins that go down inside this little lip right here, this little hook. They're held in with this little snap ring back here. So we gotta pop that off and then it should just slide right out. Then we'll put them right into the new radiator. We just gotta be really careful. I just hope that I don't pop this snap ring off and it disappear into the abyss of my garage. Here we go, just like that. Really simple little clip that just slides right around that pin. We have the radiator all set up, ready to be put back into the vehicle. The only concern I have is I might need to loosen up the intercooler bolts a little bit so that it can tip forward and out of the way. This being a little bit thicker of a radiator may interfere with where the intercooler is currently located. So we'll do that real quick, loosen that up just so it has a little bit of movement, and then we'll slap this thing back into the car. Might have to actually put those bottom pins in afterwards, because this is pretty snug to get in there. I'm going to pull this back up and remove the bottom pins for now. Attempt number 2. I believe I have the bolts available as well. Might have to undo the turbo couplers as well. We'll be back in just a second with attempt number 3. So I did not take the intercooler completely out. I just popped out the intercooler piping off of the driver's side, and then I was able to tip it forward, hopefully far enough to where we can slip the radiator down into place. You know what? I might have to take the intercooler off after all, just to be able to get access to the front of those bottom pins where those snap rings are at. Shucks. So we have the radiator bolted into the car. The first thing that is going to be an issue, it will be, the Mishimoto radiator has the upper hose or radiator outlet directly in line with the throttle body. That makes it quite a challenge for running a radiator hose because you have to do an immediate 90 right here. Originally it would go to the front of the block right here, but it's going this direction. I had an aluminum pipe right here. I can no longer run that aluminum pipe up here. I do have a silicone 90 that I might be able to squeeze in here, and like it'll have to be squished off to the side, but you can already tell like there's no room there. What the heck? This thing should be at an angle off to the side. I don't have an aluminum welder or an ability to weld aluminum right now, So I'm gonna unfortunately have to leave that alone and leave that there. And I'm gonna have to figure out something routing intercooler piping to that throttle body. Well, with that minor issue, we're kind of gonna set that issue off to the side for a minute. We're gonna put the fans back in here and then get a little bit better idea of where we can route intercooler piping now that we have this little bit of an issue. It is now the next day. I'll be honest with you guys, I just had to shut the camera off and really focus and work on this a little bit. I got a little frustrated yesterday. This radiator is not 100% just drop-in ready. I did have to modify a few things. I'll show you what I had to do real quick. So on the mounting brackets on the side, you can kind of see from here, I ended up drilling a different hole to try and move the radiator farther forward in the engine bay. This radiator, being that it is an inch thicker than the stock one, pushed everything closer to the engine, which made things very tight on like the sway bar down here and really close to the pulleys. When you start to make things really compressed in the engine bay, it makes it more challenging and difficult to work on, and that's exactly what happened. Things got a little bit difficult yesterday and I just needed to focus on it. As you can tell right here, the top outlet of the radiator, it comes straight out from the throttle body right here, which is quite an issue. It makes it very tight right here. There's like an inch to work with. Even if I would find a 90-degree hose right here, it would still rub on the intercooler pipe right here. So I played around with a couple of different 90 degrees right here. I had like a silicone one that would have just squished and it wouldn't have worked either. I also pulled off the other neck that came off of the throttle body, and if you can tell right there, it is cracked and squished. I did squish this last year to try and create a little bit more room for this radiator hose. I didn't realize that I squished the bottom side so bad that it actually created a hole. Now that hole basically creates a giant boost leak. Because the coupler was not completely covering that hole, I'm losing power. No wonder why I kind of felt a little slower towards the end of the year last year after I did this, because I created a boost leak. Now we have a different piece in there. Hopefully that will solve that issue. Now the OEM throttle body on a Miata has a lower portion to it that basically allows coolant to go in here, and it's controlled electronically to basically warm up your throttle body in colder temperatures. I don't really need that, but I can't just take it apart because then it leaves the bottom of the throttle body open. This hose right here basically allows warm air from this section down into your intake, so it keeps your intake manifold at a more level or even temperature in colder weather. Well, that's not a big deal to me. I had to replace this original tubing. It is hard as a rock and it was not going to fit around the intercooler piping right here. So yes, this is pinched. It can still allow some air in it, but basically I just had to plug this hole and then plug the hole that I put into the intake piping down here. So that's a new piece, not really doing anything, but that's what I had to do. I had to run into town to grab that. Overall, I took maybe 3 hours playing around with intercooler piping off the throttle body to try and make that work. So after modifying the mounting brackets on the radiator, I did get it to sit closer to the front side of the engine bay, which is great. The fans are bolted in and there's a little bit more clearance there on the sway bar. I did not want to have to take my sway bar out. I like the way it feels, but if I hadn't moved it forward, I probably would have to take out my sway bar, and that's no good. So we will continue on putting the rest of the intercooler piping in, and then we should hopefully be able to get everything else buttoned up, and we will get the fans plugged back in, and we'll start putting some water back in here. I had said yesterday that we have to switch to water this year per the track rules. It's just easier for them to clean up the track if something spills. It's probably been another hour. After finagling with some of the intercooler piping a little bit more, I did make the decision to just pull out the sway bar. It's gonna make my life much easier and much easier to work on this in the future. That being said, I will not be getting rid of the sway bar for the front because I'm not completely sure how it's gonna feel. The suspension will change probably quite a bit without a sway bar, but we'll find out. I'll keep that. If I need to put it in, I will, and then we'll have to readjust the couplers and some of the intercooler piping at that time. But if we take a look at the engine bay now, the radiator is hard mounted in, it's fully bolted in, the fans are bolted in, wired back in, coolant hose and the overflow is back in and ready to go. The intercooler piping and all the couplers and clamps are tight. At least I hope they're tight. We are going to do a quick boost leak test. I haven't done that in quite a while. Now that I have that new elbow on the intake manifold, I do want to check just to make sure there's no leaks. All right, so with the boost leak tester, I just have my air compressor with some air in it. I'm not gonna go super crazy with it. I'm only running up to about 15 PSI of boost anyways. A boost leak test just feeds air into the inlet of the turbo and just basically puts compressed air into your intercooler and your charge piping, and to see if there's any holes or leaks where any of the clamps or silicone couplers are. So we're gonna put maybe 20 pounds into it because I'm not planning to run 20 PSI of boost at all, but we still wanna test over what we're trying to accomplish for boost. I'll just throw a little bit in here. I don't have a clamp to clamp this on, but it's already pretty snug. So if it does leak out of here, it is what it is. Well, I think it's actually leaking out of my blow-off valve because it's pressurizing inside, creating like a negative pressure to like push. It did sound like something is leaking around this area. I don't have a spray bottle to be able to like check, but maybe I'll look into it a little bit. It was pushing this straight off the turbo, so I will have to figure out a clamp to be able to test this better. We got the boost leak test done for now. There's a small leak right down off of this little barb that is threaded in for this like intake temperature control stuff. That is not a super huge deal. It is a very, very, very small leak. When I sprayed some soapy water on it, it barely leaked out anything. So we'll just leave that alone. I'll maybe address that at a later date and just smear some like silicone to plug just this tiny, tiny little hole. Not a big deal. We're not going to lose a ton of power from that. So the rest of the stuff is all buttoned up in here. I got the intake back onto the turbo. Everything over here is all done. The next thing to do would be drop the back side of the car so that the front of the car or the radiator is at the highest point, so that as much air in the system can bleed out the best it can. I got the back of the car dropped on the ground. Now we're ready to put some distilled water into this. I'm not a super huge fan of putting water into any vehicle living in Minnesota, being that it's in April. There is still a chance that it can get down into the 30s and potentially some high 20s and have some freezing capabilities. I don't want any damage to my engine, but per track regulations this year, we are going to put water in. Now, if you do run water in your vehicle, it's best to run distilled water because there's less minerals to be able to build up and cause issues in your engine. I would also recommend running like water wetter. It's just a compound that helps lubricate your water pump and your coolant system. It's not absolutely necessary, you don't have to, but it does help. Distilled water does also have a lower boiling point than antifreeze. Antifreeze, I believe, is around 240 degrees, whereas regular water is 212. Probably the only positive for me, water is much cheaper than antifreeze. One positive for the track, or maybe multiple, is it's much easier to clean up just water off the track than antifreeze that has like a lubricity or an oily texture to it, so that sits on the concrete for a lot longer. I got the majority of the water into the coolant system, the radiator's full, and I tried to just squeeze on the radiator hoses a little bit to get any air bubbles out of the lines. Now it's time to start the car up and just let it heat cycle. Once the thermostat opens, I'll be able to continue to add water into the system until it's completely purged out. All right, I got the water in the radiator. I got it all sealed up. It took about 2 1/3 gallons. With antifreeze in the stock radiator, it only took about 1.5 gallons to fill up the radiator, so that is an entire extra gallon of water or coolant that is going to be in this coolant system. That should help out a lot. All right, well, as you can kind of tell, the fans are running right now. I took it around the parking lot. Everything kind of checks out. There's no leaks underneath, so we should be all set and ready to go. And with that, that's going to wrap up today's episode. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.